So with the new USP requirements for Chapter 41, they actually specify the test weight that you should use for repeatability test. Now, it was common practice prior to use a wire weight to perform this test on an analytical or a microbalance. Repeatability itself is practically constant on the low end of your instruments, meaning that when you get below 5%, the repeatability doesn't really change. So, new recommendations by USP, which again can be used in any other type of environment, is to use a test weight that is 5% of the balance's capacity or less. The reason why we recommend to use a test weight closer to 5% and not way below 5% is that it's much easier to handle a cylindrical mass like this than it is to handle a wire weight. Those steel masses also stay in calibration much longer than a wire weight. What that means is that it's going to be easier for the end user to handle when performing routine testing, and it's not going to go out of calibration as frequently. Now let's talk about the actual concept of minimum weight. One of the most common misconceptions that I encounter in any type of environment that I go into, whether it's food and beverage, whether it's industry, whether it's pharmaceutical company, or even if it's food and beverage testing as an example. There's a misconception that the minimum weight can be surpassed by ensuring that your tare vessel weighs more than your minimum weight. So let's say that your minimum weight is 1 milligram. You're weighing an API for a particular drug. That needs to be 1 milligram. Some people will assume if you take a weighbow or a piece of weight paper and place it on that instrument and go past that 1 milligram, that you've actually been able to supersede your minimum weight. This is not the case, and it is explicitly stated in Chapter 1251 of USP that the minimum weight applies to the sample weight and not to the tare or gross weight. What this means is that when we talk about minimum weight for the rest of this presentation, we're talking about the sample weight that you're trying to actually measure. Now, let's talk about the concept of a safety factor. When I say safety factor, what I mean is that when you establish your minimum weight, which again, for let's say a technician coming into your facility, they would be performing a repeatability test. They would be using that equation that I presented prior, and you'd be getting a particular weight value. So let's say that your minimum weight on a 5-place analytical balance is 30 milligrams. You tested it in June of this year. You tested it in a very stable environment that is temperature and humidity controlled. But then you end up moving that instrument to another facility or to another location. And you retest it, and you get roughly the same minimum weight. But again, this is still in the month of June. What happens throughout the lifespan of your instrument, especially in between calibrations, is that the weigh cell actually drifts out of calibration. This is due to, again, the environmental factors that I discussed earlier, such as electrostatics, changes in temperature and humidity. The fact that different operators that use that instrument might have a different weighing technique. Let's say technician 1 comes in and weighs on an analytical balance, but is placing their hand inside the draft shield, which is bringing in heat from their hand, electrostatics from their glove, and also airflow. And then you have technician 2 that is not doing that, that's using a forceps or a spatula to bring their sample in without actually bringing their hand. That's very simple change of having your hand placed in the balance and having the other technician not having your hand in the balance is actually going to cause the uncertainty of measurement to vary between those two different technicians. Also, the standard deviation of a finite number of replicate weighings is only an estimation of the true standard deviation, which for all weighing instrumentation is unknown. When you determine the minimum weight with a test weight, which is stainless steel, you actually are going to achieve more than likely a better minimum weight than when you're weighing sample. When you weigh powders, as an example, which are very static, that static on that powder is going to increase your uncertainty of measurement. Stainless steel masses aren't going to have a lot of static forces on them. So when you perform your repeatability test with a calibration weight, you're actually going to achieve more than likely a lower minimum weight than when you would by doing any sort of normal, everyday laboratory weighing. The tare vessel itself also induces uncertainty of measurement. Weigh paper is very waxy and has a very high potential for static generation. Weigh boats are typically made out of plastic, and they also have a very high potential for electrostatics. Simply by putting a tare vessel into an analytical draft shield or a microbalance draft shield, you're going to be increasing the uncertainty of measurement. And when you do your repeatability test or your calibrations, you're not putting tare vessels on before you put your stainless steel mass on. So, for all of these reasons above, it's important to establish the safety factor on all of your weighing devices. So what exactly does that mean? I'm going to give you an explanation for kind of a real-life scenario here. Let's say that, again, in my prior example, you established a minimum weight of 30 milligrams on a 5-place analytical balance. That would be a safety factor of 1, meaning that when you established that minimum weight of 30 milligrams, that was done after calculating, using the repeatability, of a stainless steel calibration weight. But again, we're not weighing stainless steel calibration weights when we're doing everyday weighing. So, think of a car going down a highway, a 1-lane highway, going 70 miles an hour. The safety factor of 1, you have no deviation that you can do in that highway. If you swerve to left or right, you're going to go off that highway. Safety factor of 2, now your highway turns into a 2-lane highway, and you're driving right down the middle. If you deviate to the left or the right, you're still within that safety net. Safety factor of 3, you would be on a 3-lane highway, etc. So let's give an actual example of the deviation that can occur from a calibration that is performed initially when you install your balance, and what will happen throughout, let's say, a 6-month period in between calibrations. So for this example, you establish 30 milligrams on your analytical balance. You have 6 months of use throughout that, where there's environmental changes, the changes in temperature and humidity outside, and the seasons are changing. Maybe you have a new technician that comes in that has an off-weighing technique and is inducing a lot of uncertainty. Or maybe your facility isn't temperature and humidity controlled and there's a lot of fluctuations throughout the day. Throughout those 6 months or 3 months or 12 months, your actual minimum weight is going to increase or deviate. Sometimes, in all honesty, it can actually decrease. But the point is that it's not going to stay the same. When you establish that minimum weight, when you do your initial qualification, operational qualification, when you first get that balance, it's not going to be the same throughout the entire year. So when a technician comes and tests the actual minimum weight, he might notice that it's higher than it was 6 months ago. So he'll readjust it, or as left, as it's called, back down to the value it was before. Again, once that technician leaves your facility and you start performing weighings on that particular instrument, your minimum weight is going to change. And because of that reason, again, it's important that when you establish your minimum weight, you give yourself a relative level of safety. So as my prior example of 30 milligrams, if you were to take 30 milligrams and give yourself a safety factor of 1.5, you're looking at 45 milligrams. What that means is that if you have 45 milligrams in that particular instrument that tested to be able to perform at 30 milligrams when you performed your repeatability test, you're giving yourself 15 milligrams of room so that in case on, let's say, a Tuesday, it's very dry outside and the static potential is very high in your lab, you're ensuring yourself that you're not going to get below that 30 milligrams. If you stay at 30 milligrams, you don't give yourself a safety factor, and on that same Tuesday there's a lot of static in your facility, you run the risk of going below that 30 milligrams in terms of the uncertainty measurement, and in turn you will not be meeting your process tolerances or your accuracy limitations. So as an example here, let's say your weighing accuracy is 1%, plus or minus 1%. You establish your minimum weight, which ends up being 1.2 grams. This table here will show you what your minimum weight will actually be by applying a safety factor. Very simply put, you will take your minimum weight and you will times it by a certain value.